Wisdom has built her house and set up 7 strong pillars. Proverbs 9:1. Dear unknown friend. In the previous letter, we talked about the magician, which represents smart thinking and friendliness, as well as being spontaneous. It involves focusing easily and noticing connections based on similarities. This idea is about the pure form of intelligence, which is like fire or wind. It comes and goes, and when it's gone, something else takes its place. Just like the wind blows freely and you can hear it but can't see where it comes from or where it goes, people born of the Spirit are similarly mysterious. We can't fully grasp the pure act of intelligence. We only understand it through its reflection. This reflection creates an inner image that we remember, and memory allows us to share ideas through spoken words. Writing then captures these spoken words, resulting in a book. The second idea, represented by the High Priestess, shows how the reflection of the first idea turns into a book. It explains how fire and wind become science and book, or how wisdom builds her house. We only become aware of the pure act of intelligence through its reflection. We need an inner mirror to understand it, and to know where it comes from and where it goes. The pure act of intelligence is an event, but on its own, it doesn't help us become aware of it. Awareness comes from 2 principles, the active one and the passive one that reflects. To understand where the Spirit comes from and where it goes, we need water to reflect it. This is why the conversation between the Master and Nicodemus emphasizes that you must be born of water and Spirit to enter the kingdom of God. The Master repeats truly, truly to highlight the importance of truth. He explains that full awareness of truth comes from both the truth we take in and the truth we reflect back. Reintegrated consciousness, which is the kingdom of God, requires 2 changes that are as important as being born. These changes happen in the 2 main parts of consciousness, the active spirit and the reflecting water. The spirit needs to become the divine breath instead of just personal actions, and the water must become a perfect mirror of this divine breath, free from distractions like emotions and personal desires. Reintegrated consciousness is born from water and spirit when water becomes pure again, and the spirit transforms into divine breath, or the Holy Spirit. This process is similar to the birth of the Word. By the power of the Holy Spirit, the Word became incarnate from the Virgin Mary. The rebirth from water and spirit that the Master talks about with Nicodemus restores the state of consciousness that existed before the fall when the Spirit was divine breath, and this breath was reflected by pure nature. This is what Christian yoga aims for. It doesn't seek a state without breath and reflection, but rather a baptism from water and spirit, which perfectly responds to divine action. These 2 kinds of baptism help bring together the active and passive parts of consciousness. Consciousness cannot exist without both elements. Ignoring this duality through methods that promote unity can lead to a loss of consciousness, not being. Instead of being a new birth of consciousness, it would be a return to a state before birth. Plotinus explains that behind all forms and levels of consciousness, there is this duality of the active principle and its mirror. He says that when the mirror is present, we see the image it reflects. If the mirror isn't there or isn't clear, the object is still there, but we can't see it properly. Similarly, when our inner mirror, which reflects thoughts and understanding, is calm, we can perceive them just like we sense other things. But if this mirror is disturbed, our thinking happens without any clear images, and we think without a mental picture. This idea comes from the Platonic view of consciousness, and studying it can help us understand the deeper conversation between the Master and Nicodemus about the reintegration of consciousness and the goal of Christian yoga. Christian yoga doesn't aim for unity in a direct way, but rather seeks a unity that includes 2 elements. This is important for understanding the serious issue of unity and duality. This issue can either lead us to deep spiritual truths or keep us away from them forever. It all depends on how we understand it. We can choose to believe in monism, which says there is only one essence or being. Or we can believe in dualism, based on our experiences, which recognizes that there are 2 principles in the world, good and evil, spirit and matter. Even if this duality is hard to understand, we must accept it as a fact. There's also a third perspective. Love is the cosmic principle that accepts duality while suggesting a deeper unity that isn't physical but is still essential. These three viewpoints form the foundation of different philosophies. Vedanta, Advaita, supports monism, Manichaeism, and some Gnostic teachings support dualism, and the Judeo-Christian tradition emphasizes love. To better understand this issue and explore it more deeply, we will start with what Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin says about the number 2 in his book On Numbers. First, let's look at how unity and the number 2 relate to each other. When we think about a great truth like the Creator's power, majesty, love, or light, we focus completely on this supreme being. In this state, all our thoughts are directed toward Him, and we become one with Him. This reflects the idea of unity, and the number 1 represents this closeness, which should also exist between the Creator and everything He has created. However, if we turn our attention back to ourselves and think that we are the source of the light or satisfaction we receive from the Creator, we create 2 separate centers of contemplation. This means we have 2 different principles that are not connected, leading to 2 forms of unity, one that is real and one that is just an illusion. Dividing existence creates 2 parts, which moves us from a whole to just a part, and this is where the true source of false duality arises. This example shows how the number 2 is born and reveals the origin of evil, which is this false duality. But is this the only way to understand duality? Is there a legitimate form of duality that doesn't diminish unity but actually enriches it? When we think about Saint Martin's idea of 2 centers of contemplation being separate and rival, we can question whether they really have to be so. The term contemplation suggests that these 2 centers could work together, like 2 eyes looking at different aspects of reality, the seen and the unseen. It's through these 2 centers that we can understand what is above and what is below. For example, can we express the main idea of the Emerald Tablet if we only have 1 center of contemplation? The Sefer Yetzirah states that 2 is the breath that comes from the Spirit, and it forms 22 sounds, but the Spirit is above all of this. This means that 2 represents the divine breath and its reflection, which are the foundations of the world and Holy Scripture. 2 signifies the awareness of the Spirit's breath and its formed letters. It also represents the reintegration of consciousness, as shown by the Master to Nicodemus with the pure water and the Holy Spirit's breath. The number 2 is much more than just the false duality mentioned by Saint Martin. It embodies love and the essential relationship it requires. Love cannot exist without both a lover and the loved, without me and you, without one and the other. If God were only one and hadn't created the world, He wouldn't be the loving God described by the Master, or the God that St. John speaks of when he says, God is love, and those who live in God, and God lives in them. This is because if God only loved Himself, He wouldn't be truly loving. Since this is not possible for a God of love, He is known to us as the Eternal Trinity, the source of love, the Father, the one who is loved, the Son, and the love that connects them, the Holy Spirit. Do you, dear unknown friend, also feel uneasy when you see phrases about the Holy Trinity like power, wisdom, love, or being, consciousness, bliss? I've always felt this way too, and it took me many years to understand why. It's because God is love, and love cannot be compared to anything else. It is greater than power, wisdom, or even existence. We can talk about the power of love, or the wisdom of love, to distinguish between the 3 persons of the Trinity. But we cannot place love on the same level as power, wisdom, or existence. Love is what gives meaning to these things. Without love, existence has no value. Living without love would be terrible. It would be like hell. So does love surpass existence? After the events of the last 19 centuries, especially the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, how can we doubt this? His sacrifice of life and being through love shows that love is greater than existence. And the resurrection shows that love not only is greater than existence, but also creates and restores it. The question of whether love or existence is more important goes back to ancient times. Plato discussed this when he said that the sun gives visibility to objects and helps them grow, even though the sun itself is not growth. Similarly, the goodness of God allows us to know things and gives them existence, even though God is not the essence of those things. God transcends essence in worth and power. 7 centuries later, Sallustius, a friend of Emperor Julian, said that if the first cause was a soul, then everything would have a soul. If it was intelligence, everything would be intelligent. If it was being, everything would just exist. Some people think the first cause is just being because everything has existence. But this idea only works if things exist without being good. However, since things exist because of their goodness, the first cause must be greater than just existence. It must be good. A clear example of this is that noble people often put aside their own existence for the sake of goodness, like their country, friends, or virtue. Many philosophers like Plotinus, Proclus, and Dionysius the Areopagite have talked about the importance of good compared to being. Saint Bonaventura tried to reconcile the idea of good from Plato with the idea of being from Moses, who said, "I am that I am." John Damascenus and Thomas Aquinas both emphasized the name qui est, he who is, for God because it simply means being itself. Etienne Gilson agreed with Aquinas and others, saying that the idea of being is central to Christian philosophy, and it was Moses who introduced this concept. But what does it mean to focus on the idea of being instead of good or love? The idea of being is neutral in terms of morality. You don't need to experience goodness or beauty to understand it. Even just observing minerals shows you that being exists. This makes the idea of being objective. It points to the underlying reality behind everything. I invite you, dear unknown friend, to close your eyes and imagine what this idea of being looks like. You might picture something shapeless or colorless, like water in the sea. No matter how you imagine it, the idea of being is morally neutral and naturalistic. It suggests something passive and unchanging. In contrast, when you think of love or the idea of good, you're facing something active and essential, which is deeply connected to moral life. The image that comes with this active notion could be fire or the sun, which Plato compared to the idea of good and its light to truth, instead of a vague liquid substance. Thales and Heraclitus had different views. One saw water as the essence of everything, while the other saw it in fire. The idea of good and its peak, love, comes from viewing the world as a moral journey, while the idea of being and its peak, God qui est, comes from seeing the world as a natural fact. The idea of good and of love is subjective, meaning you need to have experienced emotional and spiritual life to understand it. On the other hand, the idea of being is objective and requires only some basic experience of the physical world, like minerals. The choice between focusing on being or love affects how one experiences practical mysticism. If someone chooses being, they will seek true existence. If they choose love, they will seek love itself. You find what you are looking for. A person seeking true being will find peace in existence, and since there can only be one true being, the idea of a separate self will fade away. In this mystical path, someone may lose the ability to cry. For example, a skilled practitioner of yoga or Vedanta might never shed tears, while masters of the Kabbalah often cry. Christian mysticism also talks about the gift of tears as a special blessing from God. The Master cried at Lazarus's tomb, showing that those who focus on the God of love often have this gift of tears. This reflects their mystical experience, where their connection with the divine is not about losing themselves, but about feeling the warmth and light of divine love. When the soul experiences this love, it may cry because it feels a deep connection. This is where two separate beings meet, and instead of losing their individuality, they become more alive and passionate. This experience represents a union between two distinct substances while still maintaining their individuality, especially through love. I mentioned two substances and one essence. It's important to understand what these terms mean. In the past, substance, substantia, and essence, essentia, were seen as two different categories of existence and awareness. Plato distinguished between being einai, einai, and essence, ousia, ousia. For him, being refers simply to existence, while essence refers to existence that comes from ideas. Everything that exists has an essence because it participates in ideas which are also essences. So essence does not just mean abstract existence. It refers to the reality of the idea. Essence signifies the positive act through which something exists. In Kabbalistic thought, this is related to the act of emanation from the first sephira, Kether, which corresponds to the divine name Ahih, meaning I am, from Ein Sof, the unlimited. The term essence properly belongs to God alone. Everything else falls under the category of substances. This idea is echoed by St. Augustine, who said that God should not be called a substance, but should be referred to as essence, which is the correct term. He suggests that perhaps only God should be called essence. The difference between substance and essence, reality and the ideal, being and love, or the idea of good, or between God and Ein Sof is also important for understanding the Gospel of John. It says, "No one has ever seen God. The only Son who is close to the Father has made him known." John 1:18. When it says no one has ever seen God, it means that no one has ever looked at God face to face while still being themselves. To see means to truly perceive something while standing in front of it. Before Jesus, many people had experiences of God, like the prophets being seized by God, mystics being immersed in God, or wise philosophers seeing God's work in the world. However, no one ever truly saw God. The inspiration of prophets, the immersion of mystics, and the contemplation of sages do not equal the new experience of seeing God, the beatific vision in Christian theology. This vision happens in the realm of essence, which goes beyond all substance. It's not about losing oneself. Instead, it's an encounter where the individual personality remains intact and becomes truly itself, as God has always conceived it. Understanding St. John's words helps clarify the Master's words in the Gospel. "All who came before me are thieves and robbers." John 10:8. This statement holds a deep mystery. How can it be understood alongside the many references to Moses, David, and other prophets who came before him? Here it's not about theft, but about the principle of initiation before and after Jesus Christ. The teachers before his arrival taught about experiencing God, but this often meant diminishing the individual personality when someone was seized or immersed in God. In this sense, these masters were thieves and robbers because they testified to God while promoting a way that led to a loss of individuality. They became witnesses or martyrs for God. For example, the greatness of figures like Bhagavan and Buddha came from the high level of depersonalization they achieved. Yoga masters also focus on depersonalization. Ancient philosophers, especially the Stoics, practice this as well. This is why people who choose the path of depersonalization cannot cry and have dry eyes forever. It is the personality that cries and has the gift of tears. As it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Matthew 5:4. This helps us understand the mysterious words about thieves and robbers. When the Gospel talks about those who came before Jesus, it refers not just to time, but also to the level of spiritual initiation. They are considered thieves and robbers because they taught that people should lose their individuality. In contrast, the Master says, "I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly." John 10:10. He came to make the personality, represented as sheep, more alive and protect it from danger. This idea might seem strange compared to thinkers like Nietzsche, who emphasized powerful individuals like Alexander the Great or Napoleon. But the desire for power or glory does not define a person's greatness. The sheep in the Master's words represent the individual soul that lives. He wants each soul to live fully and safely, as God intends. The sheep symbolizes a living being that is cared for by the divine. Isn't this a meaningful image? Is it too weak compared to a magician summoning spirits? We should focus on one important point. The Master speaks in the language of love, not in terms of psychology, philosophy, or science. The great magician, artistic genius, deep thinker, and radiant mystic may be impressive, but they do not overshadow God. To God, they are beloved sheep, and He wants them to stay safe and live increasingly fuller lives. Before we finish discussing the idea of two, legitimate and illegitimate duality, I want to acknowledge Saint Yves d'Alvedre for his insightful work. In his book Mission of the Jews, 1956, he compared the complete divine name, Yod-He, with the incomplete name, He. In the complete name, Yod represents the highest principle, while in the incomplete name, He represents substance. This comparison shows how spiritualism and naturalism developed, affecting religion, philosophy, science, and society. While his formulation is clear and precise, I must say that the content he provides leaves something to be desired. He claims that Yod represents pure intellect, while He relates to love and soul, or the passionate principle. In attributing more importance to intellect as the masculine spiritual principle, he puts love in a subordinate role as the feminine emotional principle. However, the master taught about the Father, who is love. Intellect, being a reflection of love, can only be seen as the feminine principle, often called Sophia or wisdom, which helps the Creator in the act of creation, according to the Old Testament. The Gnostic tradition also views Sophia as the feminine aspect. Pure intellect reflects, while love takes action. Even though men are usually more intellectual than women, this doesn't mean that intellect is masculine. In fact, men, being physically masculine, can be seen as feminine in terms of their emotions, while women, being physically feminine, can be more active in their souls. Intellect represents the feminine side of the soul, while the creative imagination is the masculine aspect. An intellect that isn't inspired by the heart through imagination is unproductive. It relies on impulses from the heart that come through imagination. The third principle, the spirit, is neither intellect nor imagination, but love wisdom. Ideally, it should be androgynous, but in practice, it often isn't. This brings us to the significance of the problem of two, which is key to understanding the second arcanum, the High Priestess. This arcanum represents the duality in consciousness, spontaneous action, and its reflection. It involves the transformation of pure action into ideas, ideas into memories, memories into words, and words into written forms, like a book. The High Priestess wears a three-layered crown and holds an open book. The crown, adorned with precious stones, symbolizes the three stages through which pure action descends before reaching the fourth stage, the book. This relates to concepts like reflection, memory, words, and writing, which together represent revelation and tradition, both spoken and written, collectively known as Gnosis. Gnosis is about deeper knowledge, not scientific facts. It reflects the descent of revelation, the pure essence reflected by substance, down to the final stage, the book. In contrast, science starts with facts, the characters of nature, and moves from facts to laws and then to principles. Gnosis reflects what is above, while science interprets what is below. The final stage of Gnosis is when it becomes factual, turning into the book. The first stage of science involves reading these facts to develop laws and principles. The card of the High Priestess symbolizes Gnosis, not science. It represents a priestess, the guardian of the Book of Revelation, rather than a scientist or doctor. The High Priestess illustrates the stages of Revelation's descent, from the top of her crown to the open book on her lap. Her seated position signifies a connection between the vertical and horizontal aspects of this projection. The vertical being the crown, revelation, and the horizontal being the book, the practical application. This position shows the practical method of Gnosis, while the standing magician represents the practical method of mysticism. The magician is standing because he takes risks. The High Priestess is seated because she possesses knowledge. The shift from daring to knowing is represented by the transition from the magician's stance to that of the High Priestess. The core of pure mysticism is creative activity. A person becomes a mystic by daring to elevate themselves, to stand upright, and to rise even higher, beyond all created beings to reach the essence of being, which is the divine creative fire. Concentration without effort means being focused without stress, like a fire that burns without smoke or crackling sounds. For a person, this means daring to reach for the highest reality, and this can only happen when the soul is calm and the body is completely relaxed, without smoke or noise. The essence of pure Gnosis is reflective mysticism. Gnosis means that what happens in mysticism has turned into higher knowledge. In other words, Gnosis is mysticism that becomes aware of itself. It is the mystical experience transformed into knowledge. This transformation happens in stages. The first stage is pure reflection, or an imaginative repetition of the experience. The second stage is when it enters memory. The third stage involves thinking and feeling about it, turning it into a message or inner word. The fourth stage is when it becomes a symbol or writing or book, when it is clearly expressed. The pure reflection of mystical experience has no images or words. It is simply movement, where consciousness is influenced by direct contact with something beyond itself, something trans-subjective. This experience is as certain as the sense of touch in the physical world, and is just as formless, colorless, and soundless. For this reason, it can be compared to the sense of touch and called spiritual touch, or intuition. This term isn't perfect, but it at least captures the idea of immediate contact that characterizes the first stage of reflecting on the mystical act. At this point, mystical experience and gnosis are still closely linked in our one. To connect the state of consciousness with the three following states and the sacred name, Yod-He-Vav-He, shortened to YHVH, which represents Jewish Gnosis and Kabbalah, we attribute it to the first letter, Yod. The letter Yod is like a point that suggests a direction. This is similar to the experience of spiritual touch, which is also a point that contains a world of possibilities within it. Spiritual touch, or intuition, allows our consciousness to connect with the world of pure mystical experience. This connection is what creates a real relationship between the living soul and the living God, which is the essence of true religion. Mysticism is the foundation of all religion. Without it, religion and the spiritual life of humanity would be reduced to just a set of laws guiding thoughts and actions. If God means more to people than just an abstract idea, it is because of spiritual touch, or mysticism. It is the root of all religious life, including its theology, rituals, and practices. Mysticism is also the source of gnosis, which is deeper knowledge, just as magic is a special art, and Hermeticism is a type of philosophy. In this framework, mysticism corresponds to Yod in the Tetragrammaton, while gnosis corresponds to the first He. Magic represents the Vau, the child of mysticism and gnosis, and Hermetic philosophy corresponds to the second He, which sums up what has been revealed. The last He, or Hermetic philosophy, is like the book that the High Priestess holds on her lap. The three layers of her tiara symbolize the stages of revelation descending from the mystical level to the gnostic level, then to the magical level, and finally to the philosophical level, the level of the book, or doctrine. Just as spiritual touch represents the mystical sense, there are also a gnostic sense, a magical sense, and a special Hermetic philosophical sense. To fully understand the sacred name HVH, one needs to experience all four senses and practice four different methods. The basic idea of Hermetic knowledge is that each object of knowledge requires a specific method of understanding. This means we should not use the same method for different levels of understanding, but rather apply appropriate methods for similar objects within the same level. A clear example of ignoring this principle is cybernetic psychology, which tries to explain human psychology using mechanical and material laws. Each way of experiencing and knowing something can develop into a sense or create a special understanding. If someone aims to experience the essence of being, they will develop the mystical sense or spiritual touch. If they want to not only live through these experiences but also understand them, they will cultivate the gnostic sense. If they want to put into practice what they've learned from their mystical experiences, they will develop the magical sense. Finally, if they wish for their experiences, understandings, and practices to be shared with others and passed down through generations, they must develop the Hermetic philosophical sense, and by doing so, they will write their book. The law that Yod-He-Vav-He expresses is about how mystical experiences turn into tradition. This is how tradition is born. Its source is mystical experience. You cannot be a Gnostic, magician, or Hermetic philosopher or occultist without first being a mystic. A tradition is only alive when it forms a complete whole, resulting from the combination of mysticism, gnosis, magic, and Hermetic philosophy. If this unity is lost, the tradition starts to decay and die. When a tradition dies, its parts become disconnected. For example, if Hermetic philosophy separates from magic, gnosis, and mysticism, it turns into a self-centered system of thought that can harm people's minds and limit their freedom. A person who gets trapped in a philosophical system, and the effects of such a system are much worse than those of a sorcerer's spell, can no longer see the world, people, or history clearly. Instead, they view everything through the distorted lens of the system they are caught in. For instance, a modern Marxist will only see history through the idea of class struggle. They might think that what I say about mysticism, gnosis, magic, and philosophy is just a trick by the bourgeois class to hide the reality of how the proletariat is exploited, even though I have not inherited anything and have worked hard my whole life. Another example of being trapped by a system is Freudianism. Someone who believes in this system will likely interpret everything I write as merely a sign of suppressed desires, thinking that my interest in the tarot is a result of unmet sexual needs. Do we need more examples? We could mention Hegelians, who distort history, the scholastic realists of the Middle Ages with their Inquisition, or the rationalists of the 18th century, who were blinded by their own reasoning. Yes, these independent philosophical systems, separated from the living tradition, act like parasites, taking over the thoughts, feelings, and will of people. They can be compared to psychological issues like neurosis or obsession, and their physical analogy is cancer. As for independent magic, magic without mysticism or gnosis, it tends to decay into sorcery or a problematic, romantic aesthetic. There is no real black magic, just sorcerers who are lost because they lack the light of gnosis and mysticism. Gnosis without mystical experience is lifeless. It becomes a ghost of religion, lacking movement or vitality. It is like the dead body of religion, kept alive only by bits of knowledge from humanity's past. The idea of a universal Gnostic church is absurd when you understand the spiritual laws that govern all traditions. If mysticism does not lead to gnosis, magic, or hermetic philosophy, it will eventually turn into mere spiritual enjoyment or intoxication. A mystic who seeks mystical experiences without understanding them, drawing practical lessons from them, or wanting to help others can be compared to a spiritual drunkard. Tradition can only survive, like any living organism, when it consists of a complete mix of mysticism, gnosis, and effective magic, which is expressed as hermetic philosophy. This means that a tradition cannot thrive unless the whole person lives through it, in it, and for it. A complete person is a mystic, Gnostic, magician, and philosopher all at once. They are religious, contemplative, artistic, and intelligent. Everyone believes in something, understands something, is capable of something, and thinks about something. It is human nature that decides whether a tradition will live or die, and it is also human nature that can create and sustain a complete tradition. Each person has the potential for the four senses: mystical, Gnostic, magical, and philosophical. The practical teaching of the second arcanum, the High Priestess, focuses on developing the Gnostic sense. What is the Gnostic sense? It is the sense of contemplation. Contemplation begins when logical thinking stops. Logical thought feels fulfilled when it reaches a solid conclusion. This conclusion then becomes the starting point for contemplation, which dives deeper into the meaning of that conclusion. The Gnostic sense starts to work when it explores a deeper aspect of knowledge, looking beyond just whether something is true or false. It seeks to understand the significance of the truth found by logical thought and why that truth is true in itself, reaching for the deeper essential source of that truth. How does it do this? By listening in silence. It's like trying to remember something forgotten. Consciousness listens quietly, trying to recall something from the depths of forgetfulness that was once known. However, there is an important difference between the listening silence of contemplation and the silence that comes from trying to remember. In the second case, you are dealing with the past and present, horizontal time, while the listening silence of contemplation connects you to something above and below, vertical time. When recalling, you create an inner mirror to reflect the past. When you listen in silence during contemplation, you also make your consciousness into a mirror, but this mirror reflects what is above. It's a form of recalling that reaches into the vertical dimension. There are two types of memory: horizontal memory, which brings the past into the present, and vertical memory, which brings what is above into the present below. We can also call these mythological memory and typological memory. Henri Bergson is correct when he describes horizontal or mythological memory. He states that memory is not about going back from the present to the past, but rather moving forward from the past to the present. He also says that pure memory is a spiritual experience, meaning that when we remember, we are in the realm of the spirit. In this way, the past comes to us through our memories. This is why recalling something is often preceded by a state of quiet stillness, which acts like a mirror where the past can be reflected. According to Bergson, this stillness allows the brain to continue the act of remembering, connecting it to the present through its material nature. The same applies to vertical or typological memory. Plato also makes an important point about the memory of the transcendent self, which can help the empirical self to remember. He explains that since the soul is immortal and has lived many lives, it has seen everything in this world and beyond. Therefore, learning and research are essentially forms of recollection. In this case, what is above, in the realm of the transcendent self, descends to the level of the empirical self when there is a state of empty silence that mirrors this revelation from above. So, what do we need to do in order to reflect what is above in the mystical realm while we are awake? First, we need to be seated, which means we should create an active-passive state of consciousness, where our soul listens attentively in silence. We need to be like a woman, meaning we should be in a state of quiet expectation rather than being actively talking. We also need to cover with a veil the spaces between the realm we want to reflect and our waking consciousness where that reflection becomes real. This means we should shield ourselves from distractions. Additionally, we need to wear a 3-layered tiara, which symbolizes focusing on a significant problem or question that involves the 3 worlds and what is above. Finally, we need to turn our eyes toward the open book on our knees, meaning we should engage in a thorough mental process to clarify our results and contribute to the ongoing tradition. All of these practical guidelines for Gnosis are represented in the card of the High Priestess. She is seated, wearing a 3-layered tiara with a veil above her head to block out distractions, and she is looking at an open book on her lap. The Gnostic sense is like spiritual hearing, just as the mystical sense is like spiritual touch. This doesn't mean that the Gnostic sense hears sounds. Rather, it means that its perceptions come from a state of awareness, similar to when we listen attentively. However, the connection between what is perceived and the perceiver is not as direct as it is in spiritual touch or mystical experiences. Now, let's describe the other 2 senses, the magical sense and the hermetic philosophical sense. The magical sense involves projecting outward, while the hermetic philosophical sense involves synthesis or combining different elements. Projection means expressing and sending out the contents of our inner life. This process is similar to what happens in artistic creation on a psychic level, or when a woman gives birth on a physical level. An artist has the talent to project their ideas and feelings in a way that has a deeper impact on others than someone who is not an artist. A piece of art has its own life and can affect people on its own. Similarly, when a woman gives birth, she brings a new being into the world that has its own life and separates from her to live independently. The magical sense also involves the ability to project the contents of our inner life, which then have their own life. Magic, art, and giving birth are all similar in that they involve projecting or expressing what is within us to the outside world. The Church's teaching about the creation of the world ex nihilo, meaning the creation of forms and matter from nothing, represents the divine and cosmic peak of this idea. The belief in creation ex nihilo is the highest form of magic, stating that the world itself is a magical act. On the other hand, beliefs like pantheism, emanationism, and demiurgism take away the magical meaning of creation. Pantheism says that creatures do not exist independently. They are just parts of God's life, and the world is simply God's body. Emanationism views creatures and the world as having only a temporary existence. Demiurgism claims that out of nothing comes nothing, and teaches that there must be a substance that exists alongside God, which God uses as material for creation. So God is not the creator in a magical sense, but just a craftsman who shapes and rearranges existing materials. It's important to note that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is not the only way to explain the world around us, within us, and above us. The universe is vast, allowing for many types of creative activities that together explain our experiences. The key point is to clearly state that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo represents the highest form of magic, specifically divine and cosmic magic. However, if you ask me, dear unknown friend, whether I think the creation of the world is just a magical act without anything before or after it, I would say no. There are mystical and gnostic acts that precede creation in eternity, and after that comes the work of the demiurge or demiurgic hierarchies, who are responsible for the craftsmanship, work that involves practical or hermetic philosophical intelligence. The classical Kabbalah gives us a great example of how different beliefs can peacefully coexist. It teaches about the 10 Sephiroth, starting with the mystery of eternal mysticism, Ein Sof, or the unlimited. Then it explains the Gnostic idea of eternal emanations from the divine, which come before the act of creation. These are the ideas of God that exist within God and precede creation, which is a conscious act rather than a random impulse. After that, it discusses pure creation or creation ex nihilo, meaning the magical act of bringing forth the ideas of the creation plan, represented by the Sephiroth. This creative act is followed by the process of formation, where spiritual beings, including humans, help shape the world. According to Kabbalah, the world we experience, called Olam HaAsaya, the world of facts, is preceded by Olam HaYetzira, the world of formation. This world is a product of Olam HaBaraya, the world of creation, which is itself realized from Olam HaAtziluth, the world of emanations, which is inseparable from God, who is the ultimate mystery of supreme mysticism, Ein Sof, the unlimited. Therefore, it is possible, and we believe this strongly, to reconcile the different beliefs about creation. We just need to place each belief in its correct context or apply it to the appropriate level. The Kabbalah, through its teachings on the Sephiroth, shows us this clearly. Pantheism is true in the world of emanations, Olam HaAtziluth, where there are only ideas that exist within God and cannot be separated from Him. Theism is true when we move from the eternal realm to the realm of creation, which includes the archetypes or original forms of things we know from our experiences. Demiurgism is accurate when we look at the world of formation and the evolution of beings as they try to match their created prototypes. However, if we focus only on the level of facts, we can find that naturalism holds true within that limited context. Establishing the hierarchy of these seemingly conflicting beliefs about creation leads us into the area of the Hermetic philosophical sense, which is about synthesis. This sense, linked to the second IE in the divine name YHVAH, focuses on summarizing or seeing the whole picture. It is different from the Gnostic sense, which corresponds to the first HE and reflects the whole in its basic or early form. The Gnostic sense creates the first synthesis before breaking things down, while the Hermetic philosophical sense creates a second synthesis after analyzing the parts. The work done through this sense is not entirely creative. It is more like craftsmanship, where you shape existing materials to achieve their final form. The Emerald Tablet contains formulas that summarize the 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world, which also represent the worlds of magical experience, Gnostic revelation, and mystical experience. That's why we call this sense the Hermetic philosophical sense, referring to the synthesis of these 3 worlds in a 4th one. It operates vertically across these layered planes, hence the term Hermetic. Hermeticism is fundamentally a philosophy based on magic, Gnosis, and mysticism, aiming to unify the different levels of the larger universe and the individual. When you summarize facts from a single area like biology, you're using the scientific sense, not the Hermetic philosophical sense. The scientific sense is well known and focuses on facts within one level, horizontally. Hermeticism is not a science and will never be one. While it can use scientific findings, it remains distinct from science. Non-Hermetic modern philosophy may summarize specific sciences to act as a science of sciences, which is similar to Hermeticism. However, Hermeticism seeks to summarize experiences across all levels, which vary depending on where the experience occurs. That's why we use the term Hermetic philosophical for this sense of synthesis. It's important to note that this overview of the 4 senses, each of which is necessary for a living tradition, is only a brief introduction. The next 2 arcana, the Empress and the Emperor, will provide deeper insights and more concrete details, especially about the magical sense and the Hermetic philosophical sense. The 3rd tarot card, the Empress, represents magic, while the 4th card, the Emperor, represents Hermetic philosophy.